Fauci said recently, because we were talking about the pandemic, did an interview with the New York Times, and he talked about masks. He said, quote, from a broad public health standpoint, at the population level, masks work at the margins, maybe 10%. But for an individual who religiously wears a mask, a well-fitted KN95 or N95, it's not at the margin, it really does work. Do you see how some find this an extremely significant statement? Because for most of us, we were told it didn't matter what kind of mask. Any mask was good. Our kids had to wear masks for an extra year and a half in school, and none of them wore them the right way. That hearing that, may be good that he's saying it, but that hearing that is upsetting to a lot of people?
Well, I can certainly understand that for many people who were listening closely to the messages that were coming through and guidance as to what to do, when they recognize that sometimes guidance shifted and evolved over time, that could be disconcerting. And sometimes the guidance does evolve over time as you learn more. And I certainly remember, even though I was a private citizen the first year of the pandemic, but I was watching closely. And we were learning a lot as a country about the pandemic, and guidance shifted accordingly. But look, one thing I think that we all have to recognize is this pandemic has been incredibly hard for a lot of people, especially for kids and for parents.
That was Surgeon General Vivek Murphy on CNN talking about the loneliness epidemic and also mask requirements. And I'm glad he got that question, which I think is a very fair question. It remains the case that for the first 2 years of the pandemic, the health authorities, after initially saying, don't bother with masks, Fauci said, don't bother with masks, then it became, have to wear a mask. Everywhere, but any mask is fine. Just put a mask on your face, any mask. Now we know that guidance as well was not so good, as Dr. Fauci conceded in an interview he did for the New York Times recently, and as other health officials have admitted. We don't have really good evidence that the cloth masks that were recommended for most of the pandemic were actually doing a whole lot of good. Maybe they're doing some good, maybe it's marginal. But if you're going to protect yourself with a mask, you really ought to get one of the really good ones. That was not the guidance for a long time. And then also, we had the spectacle of wrestling these near useless masks, according to the health officials now, onto children who, I have questions about. It's harder for me to understand and hear someone if they're wearing a mask. I can only imagine for young children, learning to read. Can they hear their teachers? That whole thing. And then also we're talking about in context of a loneliness epidemic. For kids who are slower at learning, for all sorts of people who might have disabilities in terms of understanding, how much more isolating was it to have everyone masked up so aggressively like this? And now we're learning, or we're conceding or admitting that maybe a lot of that was not necessary or was not adequate for what the situation called for.
Right, yeah. I mean, even if the data shows, okay, we know in advance, let's say they knew that N95s and KN95s were necessary and they had to be worn correctly, and they told everybody this, there would still be a proportion of people who were not wearing them. There would still be some degree of non-compliance. That would have put us in a completely different situation than the one we were in, where they were like, the cloth masks are fine for the kids. Of course, kids would wear them below their nose. Adults would wear them below their nose. Many people were not wearing them correctly, all of this suggests that any policy is only as good as it is enforceable. And that has a lot to do with the messaging and the research behind the policy. How sure are you that what you're telling people to do is actually going to help them? And the pandemic happened very fast, and maybe it's unfair to say you should have known this in advance, right? They didn't have time to conduct this research and understand the real effects of different kinds of masks. But a lot of people compare it to wearing a seatbelt. And that increasing your safety in a vehicle. But a mask is a little bit different, because if I don't wear a seatbelt, it's not impacting the safety of those in other cars around me. The mask is a bit different. We were told that the effectiveness of the mask was in large part so that water particles coming out of us don't get into somebody else's breathing. How much was it a factor that there would be people, just one person who was potentially infected, unmasked in a room of people who had these cloth masks? I think that's really what we're dealing with here, and I think that might explain a lot of this marginal data.
Yeah, and look, the comparison to the seatbelt is fair enough, although I would tend to not advocate laws forcing people to wear a seatbelt. I wear my seatbelt like a good, responsible driver, human being. but it's not. I don't think it's not burdensome the way. And I know some people have no problem wearing masks. They don't find it to be a burden. I'm not one of those people. I found it incredibly uncomfortable, incredibly difficult to understand people who are wearing them. And I'm sure some kids, don't mind wearing them. But we were still, again, at a point where they were generally not required anymore. Things were opening up. Still in schools. Kids had to wear them like during athletic events, during sports games, even when outside. I mean, it was different in every municipality in the entire country, but that was still occurring where it seemed just incredible. Like I really didn't like wearing them at the gym. I didn't like wearing them to go running. I thought that was crazy, but people in this town would look at you funny if you weren't wearing them at some point. It seemed crazy to me at the time, and now we know it was all for show.
It's interesting. Yeah, like if we had this data where we're like, okay, 10%.
Yeah.
Let's take a vote. Who would rather take their chances? And you asked the sports team and you had people vote, should we all wear masks? Should the competing team wear masks? And then you move forward in that way.
And then we get into truly ridiculous stuff. This went on here in D.C. constantly. You enter a restaurant. You have to put on your mask and wear your mask until you sit down at the table. Then you can take it off. For the eating and the meal, for the laughing, the drinking, the socializing. But you get up off the table, you got to put it back on. That was never defensible, that on any level, it made absolutely no sense. But that was the policy here in D.C. I had to do that constantly, countless times. Mm-hmm. So ridiculous, it drove me to the breaking point, Jessica. Like the cliff of insanity. I was almost over the edge because it was so crazy.
I believe it. See, that's the thing. A lot of how we react to this, maybe when I had COVID twice, and I remember like my first COVID scare, I thought about all the times where I was relaxed about how secure my mask was, if I wore the mask or not, and I was like, oh, if I could go back, I would wear it properly again. And then you test negative, and you go right back to this behavior of being lax about it.
And there were some people, I don't know that there's anyone left who's like this, because again, virtually everyone who's gotten it, but people treated it like it was a moral failing, like, oh, but it's not, it's a disease. And especially when Omicron came through this town, everybody got COVID. Even finally, the most cautious among us, they too fell to the disease because it's a virus. It's not a personal judgment on you, and people who were very cautious are gonna get it and got it. People who are incautious are gonna get it and got it. Like that's just reality. Right now, the current understanding is that if you really want to protect yourself, you got to wear that KN95 and you got to wear it rigorously, and then that offers a good amount of protection, is what they're saying. I'm waiting. I wonder if a year from now we'll find out actually that was wrong too, just given that that's what's happened the previous times. But fine, I'll accept that for now. Again, they couldn't summon, I don't know that they've been able to muster tremendously compelling evidence, at least at society-wide, that keeping everyone, because it's just impossible, because people cannot wear it with that level of rigor reliably. So we'll see. It should be your choice, etc. But it was very much not your choice in certain parts of the country, including here. It was not it was not a choice for kids in school, on the playground, trying to learn to read. It drives me kind of nuts. It does. And now we're talking about a loneliness epidemic. I wonder where that came from.
Right. I think the loneliness is there, and COVID exacerbated it, right? We live in a very individualistic society. There were many people who are immunocompromised who now there's this virus. When they go in public, there's a big risk there, right? When I was in places like public transit, have the mask on. If I'm at a party with friends and everybody's unmasked, it's fine. But there is that consideration of these folks. We didn't have any systems in place to take care of those people. Did COVID cause that? Or was that already a feature of our society and COVID exacerbated it?
Yeah. All right, we'll have more Rising right after this.